Hey, Dr. Eisenbach here. How you doing? You guys are looking good. Um, Hope you're holding up. Hope you're in your house, not going anywhere. Washing your hands. This is Biology 112 Online Edition. Um, Sure to be all over your live streams, your social media. I'm sure that this online version of the class is going to be world famous when we're all said and done. Actually, I hope not. Um, well, that was an awkward way to start, but let's get going. So we're in chapter 20. We're going to look at evolution for the next couple of chapters, starting with a little bit of history, try to put evolution in its historical context. And just looking ahead, later on, we're going to be looking at Christian views and non-Christian views, and and we'll compare different models later on. So for now, starting in the book, chapter 20, I'm on page 457. Let's get going. Actually, I'm going to skip page 457. Let's go to page 458. Um, for most of human history, people had no idea about anything. They didn't know the history of the universe. They didn't know that the earth was round. They didn't know that stars are actually suns in distant galaxies. They didn't know that our sun is a star. They didn't know that mountains form through plate tectonics. They didn't know about atoms, and so they surely didn't know much about biology. And so let's begin by talking about especially European ideas about the history of life. So let's begin with Aristotle and the Greeks. So we go back to the 4th century BC, into the 3rd century BC. So the Greek philosophers um, like to use reason and logic in order to figure things out. So Aristotle is a good example of this. So he just observed the world around him and used logic to try to figure out why they exist and why they have the characteristics that they do. And so Aristotle believed that both inanimate objects and living species had fixed characteristics. So, in other words, a giraffe has always been a giraffe, and a dog has always been a dog, and a human has always been a human. And so, because of the stasis, because of the static nature of the created world, Aristotle said, look, we can organize all of the different creations. And so he came up with the Scala Natura, which was later kind of reformulated into something called the Great Chain of Being. And the basic idea here is that all living organisms can be organized according to a hierarchical scale. So if you look at the picture of the right, this is I believe, a woodcut of the Great Chain of Being. I don't know if it's a woodcut. I have no idea. It's a picture I got from Google Images, and you can see that it basically places living organisms in a hierarchy. So God is at the top, right? Below him are angels and cherubims and so on. Below the angels are all the different organisms that we have on Earth. So at the top of this chain of being is humans, and below the humans are domesticated animals, and below them are wild animals, and below them are uh, fish, and below them are plants, and below the plants would be fungi, and mushrooms, and the like, and below them would be rocks and minerals. So this great chain of being basically is the established order of things. God is most important and most powerful, so he's at the top. Rocks aren't even alive, and they're the most boring, so they're at the bottom. And in between, you've got all the different animals. Humans, which wouldn't be classified as animals in this scheme, are more important and more valuable and more powerful than wild animals. And also notice that humans are split into a hierarchy. So at the top of the human hierarchy is the kings and the rulers, and below them would be your lower classes, and at the bottom would be the peasants. So the idea of the great chain of being is that everything has its established place in nature. Right? So this is basically an application of natural theology to kind of an ad hoc classification scheme of living organisms. So this was the leading consensus for a couple of centuries after Aristotle. And it's not really until Linnaeus comes along. So Linnaeus is in the 18th century, and he establishes taxonomy. So we've already talked about that a little bit this semester. but he was the one that came up with the original kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. So basically, we can look at the characteristics of organisms and we can sort them. We can sort them and group them and basically create a catalog of all living organisms. um, and then there's the idea of biblical chronologies. So the Great Chain of Being and Linnaeus's taxonomic system were good for organizing living organisms, but they don't really help you in terms of figuring out how old things are. So the biblical chronologists said, well, let's figure out how old life is and how old the earth is. And they didn't really have scientific techniques or any sort of technology or dating techniques. They were largely unaware of fossils in distant lands. And so from their limited perspective, they said, look, we need to just go with what we've got, and that's the Bible. So they said, look, the Bible was written by God, or it's inspired by God. And the Bible has these genealogies. So Adam and Eve are the first created humans, created on day 6. And then the Bible in the Old Testament gives these long and frankly kind of boring genealogies of Adam was so old when he begat Seth, and Seth was so old when he begat, and so on and so forth. And so knowing that Jesus was born around 0 AD or 4 BC, somewhere around there, the genealogies of the Old Testament and the New Testament can be used to time or to figure out how old the earth is. So basically the Bible gives a series of lifespans that we can try to use to figure out how old life and earth is. And when you add up those genealogies, you get to an age of around 6,000 years. In other words, the creation week was around 6,000 years ago from today. So around 4,000 BC. I don't know. Can you hear my chair creaking? I'm sorry if you can. And also my mouse is really loud, clicking. With the rise of modern science, so beginning around the 16th century, we get the scientific revolution with Bacon and Newton and Galileo. We see the rise of science. So this is basically trying to understand the world using studying physical events by using experimentation and observation. And so we get the rise of some new scientific disciplines that the world really hadn't seen up until this point: biogeography, anatomy, geology, and others. And so scientists' views about the history of the universe and of life and of the earth began to change. And so there's a bunch of new ideas that come out during this time. So I'll just hit on a few. Copernicus, for example, was the first to really put forward the argument that the sun is the center of the universe. Now, you kind of probably take it for granted that the sun is the center of our solar system and that the sun isn't the center of the universe. But for a few centuries prior to Copernicus, who was alive in the 18th century, humans thought that, or at least the scientific establishment thought that the Earth was the center of the universe. So this is geocentrism. So Copernicus says, no, based on my modeling and based on my observations using a telescope, I think that the sun is the center of the universe. And so the Earth revolves around the sun, not the other way around. And Galileo used his observations to basically confirm what Copernicus said. So we see some shifts in how people are viewing the universe and Earth and man's place within it. And this is kind of shaking up the way that people, eventually it starts shaking up the way that people view biology. So the first discipline that starts to kind of make waves that we're going to talk about is biogeography. So biogeography is just the study of the world distribution of plants and animals. All right, and so let's go back a little bit. So for most of human history, people they didn't travel. So if you were in Europe, you didn't even know that there was a North and South America. You didn't know about Australia. And following the 15th century, after Columbus, more and more Europeans were traveling to the New World and bringing back people and plants and animals and stories of creatures that are really, really strange. People were traveling to Africa and bringing back gorillas. And so in Europe at least, there was this growing recognition that there's a lot of weird animals out there, and they're kind of distributed in some weird ways. And so what I mean by that is when we look at different animals that are similar, why are they similar? So if you look in the picture, you can see an emu, an ostrich, and a ray. And so these are three very similar birds. So they walk on, their hind legs. They've got wings, but they don't use them to fly. They just kind of flap around, and they mostly just run and, I don't know, frolic. And so why is this? So why do we have emus in Australia and ostriches in Africa and rays in South America? They look really similar. So these early Europeans who were looking at this data said, did God create these where they are? Did he create the emu where it is? Did he create the ostrich where it is? And they started to think that that maybe the environment was playing a role. So in other words, maybe the environment helps shape birds, and it shapes them in similar ways, and it did so on different continents. So maybe it shaped the emu, and the environment shaped the ostrich in Africa, and it shaped the ray in South America. So they end up at similar ends, but they got there by being shaped by their environment. So there was a growing recognition that the environment and where animals are living helps shape what they look like and how they behave. And it raised the question of, have animals always looked the same? In other words, do animals and plants, do organisms change with time? And so there was a growing consensus in the scientific establishment that animals do change in time. We'll talk about that more later. And as scientists looked at all these specimens from all over the world, they began to compare their morphology, which is just their anatomical structures. And they discovered some interesting similarities and differences. So if you look in the picture on the left, you see three different limbs. I don't know, I think it's probably cutting off the caption there, but on the left we've got the leg of a pig, in the middle we've got the flipper of a dolphin, on the right we've got the wing of a bat. So these are all mammals, these are all limbs, but we've got a leg, a flipper, and a wing. And what's interesting is they have a very similar morphology. So in green you can see that it's one bone, the humerus, and then there's two arm bones below the elbow, the ulna and the radius. And then there's a bunch of carpals or hand bones, and then there's finger bones or digits. And so in the pig leg, those bones are structured in a way that it creates a leg. And in the dolphin flipper, those bones are constructed in a way that builds a flipper. And in the bat wing, those bones are constructed in a way that builds a wing. So when God created a pig and a dolphin and a bat wing, was he just using the same basic blueprint, or is there something else going on? Are these shared structures evidence of shared ancestry? There's also some other weird things going on, like vestigial structures that people were starting to figure out in the 19th century. So a vestigial structure is basically a useless part, or a part that exists in an organism that isn't performing the same function that it once was. So in the picture on the right, you can see that this is a humpback whale illustration, and they have a pelvis with a teeny little femur attached to it. Now, normally a pelvis and femurs are associated with hind legs. Now, a whale doesn't have hind legs, it doesn't even have hind flippers, other than its tail. So why in the world does it have a pelvis and a femur? And so the idea is those bones, they might be playing roles in the whale's anatomy now, but they're not playing the role that they once did, because presumably the pelvis and the femur once were connection points for leg bones. So maybe whales once had hind legs. So vestigial structures were kind of starting to be viewed as evidence of changes to an organism over time, and maybe they were kind of leftovers of how an organism used to once be. There was an expanding recognition of fossils. So with the Industrial Revolution, people could dig ditches, and they were starting to do road cuts and cuts for train tracks and so on, build canals. And they had a growing realization that there's lots and lots of rock layers below their feet, and that some of these rock layers had fossils. So fossils are basically um, preserved organisms that are long dead that have turned into rock. And these fossils that people were discovering were weird. So they found that the fossils changed. The deepest fossils were the weirdest. They least resembled modern organisms. But as you went to higher and higher levels or layers, the fossils started to more closely resemble modern animals. So why is that? Why did animals change in time? Are the fossils a record of animals changing in time? Also, are fossils evidence of extinct animals? So we understand that dinosaurs are extinct, and there's lots of woolly mammoths are extinct. There's lots of examples we could talk about. But the concept of extinction was pretty controversial at the time, so people didn't think that extinction was really possible because if God created organisms, why would he create them in a way that allowed them to die and to disappear from the earth? So for a long time, people thought that these fossils of organisms are animals that are still alive somewhere in the world. But as people started to explore the world in more and more resolution, they started to realize, yeah, there really isn't a place. As cool as it would be, there's really not a place that still has dinosaurs or woolly mammoths or saber-toothed tigers. They are extinct. And so if species go extinct, then what causes one species to go extinct and another species to survive to modern times? So that gave rise to paleobiology. So this is largely established by Cuvier and others, so Frenchmen in the 18th and 19th century. And he's saying, and he's not saying, he realized that these layers of fossils represent organisms that had lived at different times in the past. So when you find a fossil layer, those are fossils that were all living at the same time, and they died at the same time or buried at the same time. And then you go a few layers higher and you find another layer of fossils representing completely different animals. And so he said these different animals, they weren't all alive at the same time. These fossils are just markers of animals that were once alive and then went extinct. And as one group of animals went extinct, later in time that area on Earth saw new animals moving in and replacing them. And so why is this? So the best Cuvier could come up with is the concept of catastrophism. So catastrophism is the idea that each layer of fossils represents organisms that had died in some sort of catastrophe. So like a flood or a volcanic eruption or something. So the idea is there were all these organisms, let's say dinosaurs, right? And then all of a sudden this flood comes or this volcano erupts and kills them and it fossilizes them. And then maybe there's no animals in that time for a while, so there's no fossils in the rock layers. And then you see fossils of new animals moving in. And so maybe God killed the dinosaurs by allowing or causing catastrophes to happen. And that is where all the dinosaur fossils came from. And then God allowed or created new organisms to move into that same area. And they lived and thrived until eventually he sent or allowed a new catastrophe to bury them. So the fossil layers and the rock layers we see below our feet are simply a record of catastrophes over time. And so a ramification of this is that the Earth's history has been one of a lot of change, different animals coming in, humans not maybe being around from the beginning, and basically an old Earth that's seen a lot of extinction events take place. All right, and then with the rise of biology, we have scientists like Lamarck, who was around in the 18th and 19th centuries, a Frenchman. And he said, or he was one of many who was realizing that animals change in time. And the question was, okay, animals are changing in time, but how? Like, what's causing them to change? And so he came up with a lot of ideas, but we can summarize them here with two principles: the principle of use and disuse, and the inheritance of acquired characteristics. So the principle of use and disuse is that as organisms use particular body parts, those body parts change. So as a giraffe uses its neck to get food, its neck maybe stretches a little bit, right? And then if it reaches up for leaves that are a little bit higher on the tree, maybe its neck gets a little bit longer. So since the giraffe is stretching its neck and using it, maybe its neck gets longer over time. Or similarly, maybe if a whale isn't using its hind legs, maybe over time, because of disuse, it will lose its hind legs. So he's just saying that there's a general principle where animals change based on how they behave and how they interact with the environment. That led to, or that, building on that, I should say, was his idea of the inheritance of acquired characteristics. So as an organism changes during its lifetime, its offspring inherit those changes. So when a giraffe stretches its neck and gets a longer neck, then it gives birth to babies that have a slightly longer neck. So over time, the neck of the giraffe gets longer during its lifetime, but it also gets longer generation to generation. So Lamarck was really important. He influenced a lot of later thinkers because he was basically trying to describe a mechanism that causes species to change in time, right? And he got a lot of things pretty close to right. So he recognized that species change in time. So yeah, I think everyone can agree that species change. And he also recognized that characteristics are passed on. So in other words, there is some degree of inheritance. So organisms don't just change in their lifetime. They change generation to generation. And Lamarck said that a lot of these changes are in response to the environment. So the environment helps influence what, a giraffe's neck getting longer or a cheetah getting faster. So he said there are mechanisms like use and disuse that drive evolutionary change, that drive animals to change over time and from generation to generation. Now, an important note here, I said Lamarck got a lot of things right, but obviously he got a lot of things wrong too. So we recognize that animals can change, so organisms can change their phenotype during their lifetime. So a classic example is a bodybuilder can lift weights and get bigger muscles, or a marathon runner can run all the time and get a better cardiovascular system to run farther and faster. But that doesn't mean that when they have a kid, that their kid is going to come out with stacked muscles, or their kid can run a marathon. So in other words, we recognize that the phenotype can change within a lifetime, but they're not necessarily passed on to the next generation. So Lamarck is important because he was trying to find a mechanism of change, even though he didn't know anything about inheritance. All right, when it comes to geology, geology was a new field. I mentioned cutting canals and road cuts. And so people were understanding the rock layers below their feet in more and more detail. So Hutton is one of the fathers of geology as a discipline. And he came up with gradualism. So he said, look, over time, sedimentation creates new layers of rock. And then those rock layers are slowly eroded away over long periods of time. So gradualism is basically just the idea that Earth changes slowly over time, and that it's changed slowly through its history. So this is a lot different than catastrophism, where we saw Cuvier arguing that there's these catastrophes that bury and create layers. So Hutton is saying it's much more gradual. Lyell expanded on Hutton's ideas and described the concept of uniformitarianism. And this is the idea that the processes that we observe today have always been in play. So if we see that sedimentation is building a rock layer at a rate of a centimeter per year, that's pretty fast, a centimeter per century, and we find a rock layer that's 5 centimeters thick, then we could say that, well, it's always been forming more or less at this average rate, and so that 5 centimeter thick rock layer took 5 centuries to form. So the implications of gradualism and uniformitarianism are that over long periods of time, the Earth changes, and it changes really slowly, like over millions of years. So then comes Darwin. So Darwin is an Englishman, born to a wealthy family, really interesting guy. He was interested in a lot of things, studied barnacles and earthworms and insects, studied to be a priest for a while, really never had a job, just was a full-time naturalist. And he got the opportunity to ride on the HMS Beagle. The Beagle was a ship that circumnavigated the globe because it was tasked with mapping coastlines. You can see its journey in the picture below. And basically the Beagle just sailed around the world and map coastlines, and Darwin would hop off the ship and he would go collect specimens and dig up fossils and hunt animals and make observations in his notebook. And while he was on this ship, for a couple years, Darwin took some reading material with him. So he read Hutton and he read Lyell and he had read Lamarck. And so these ideas of animals changing and a mechanism that causes animals to change, and then the history of the earth being really old and processes happening gradually, these ideas influenced Darwin as he observed different organisms around the globe. So a couple of things that he observed. So one is armadillos and glyptodonts. You can see the picture of the armadillo there in the center. So these things are still alive. If you've ever been down south, maybe you've seen one. You can find them in Texas and Mexico. So they're the size of a cat, I guess. And you can see they kind of got this armored shell. And Darwin saw these in South America for the first time for him. And he also found fossils of glyptodonts. So that's the picture on the upper right. And you can tell that that glyptodont fossil looks a lot like the armadillo. So this raises some interesting questions. So was the armadillo created by God during Creation Week, and the glyptodont created by God during Creation Week, and the glyptodont just went extinct? Or maybe the glyptodont was alive a long time ago and it was fossilized and it's since gone extinct, but its descendants live on, and its descendants have changed pretty dramatically and have become armadillos. So Darwin started to create a link between fossil organisms and living organisms. He also recognized that where an organism lives tends to shape its behavior and morphology. So you can see the picture of the South American nutria and the European beaver. So they look pretty similar. And they both live in these flooded habitats and eat plants that grow on the edge of the, or in the body of water. And so did God create both of these species separately, or maybe the environment has shaped these animals over time in a way that they result in pretty similar morphologies and behaviors? And most famously, Darwin visited the Galapagos Islands. So you can see that in the lower left, of a series of islands off the coast of South America. And on these islands, you had all these unique species. So there's different tortoises, and the tortoises on different islands have different shell shapes. There's finches that have different beak sizes. We'll talk about that later. And there's lots of really unique animals. So again, the question, did God create these different species of tortoises and finches on the island, or maybe there was one common ancestor to these tortoises and finches that arrived on one of the islands, and then as they spread throughout the islands, maybe they changed. So Darwin's ability to see animals living on different islands helped influence some of his later views. So a word about the finches. So here are some different finches you can find in the Galapagos Islands. So they have most notably different beak or bill shapes. So some have thick beaks, thick bills. Some have thin. Some have bills that are good for cracking large seeds, others small seeds. Some are insect feeders. And so again, did God create all these different species of finches with their different diets on the various islands? Or maybe there was an ancestral finch that spread throughout the islands, and then the resources available on these islands helped shape it into different beak shapes. Darwin was also recognizing that there was something called artificial selection going on. So in the 19th century, people were breeding pigeons and dogs and other animals. Pigeons, probably hard to relate to, but people were breeding pigeons into all these different really weird forms. You can see some of them represented in the picture. You're probably more familiar with dogs. Here's a picture of all sorts of different dog breeds. So where did all these dog breeds come from? The idea is there once were wolves, and these wolves were domesticated and basically tamed, so they weren't afraid of humans. And then over time, people selected for particular traits in these dogs. So if they wanted a dog that would fetch a duck that they just shot, they would. There was a dog that was good at that, they'd breed it. If there was a dog that had no interest in fetching their duck, then they wouldn't breed that one. And so Labrador retrievers were bred. Or maybe they wanted a dog that would help them hunt raccoons in the forest or small game in the forest, foxes in the forest. And so dogs that could smell and track were bred and ones that couldn't. And so eventually that led to beagles. And so humans have shaped dogs by selecting which traits were valuable. So you see where I'm going with this? Okay, and then Darwin was also influenced by Thomas Malthus. And Malthus said, look, the human population is starting to grow exponentially. And the problem that Malthus saw at the time was that food production was not growing exponentially, it was growing linearly. So Malthus was predicting a time where the human population would grow and outstrip food production. So what happens if you have, more people than food available? Well, the limited resource of food is going to cause people to fight and go to war, and some people will get fed and some people will not. So resources are inherently limited, and they serve to not only restrict the growth of a population, but they also shape a population. So people that can get food will survive and reproduce and have kids, and people that don't will starve to death and die. And so Darwin said, okay, well, that's interesting. Doesn't matter if Malthus is right or wrong about his predictions. What matters is, can this be applied to biology, to nature? And so he came up with the idea of natural selection. So let me emphasize that Darwin's main contribution wasn't evolution. Evolution, as we saw with Lamarck, was already in the air, the idea that animals change. Darwin's main contribution was his concept of natural selection. So here's how Darwin argued for natural selection. So first, organisms produce an abundance of offspring, and not all those offspring survive. So an oak tree produces acorns, and it produces more acorns than can possibly survive. Most of them are going to die, all right? And so why will some live and some die? Well, the ones that live are the ones that land in a place where they can get sun and water and nutrients, and the ones that die don't have those things, or they have they're unlucky and they get eaten by a squirrel or a chipmunk or something. So you've got more offspring than can possibly survive. Now, not all these offspring are the same. So number 2 says that the individuals in a population vary in their characteristics, all right, in their traits. So some of those acorns might be big, and some might be large, and some might make larger leaves, and some might make larger root systems. And so the individuals that have the characteristics that allow them to survive and then ultimately to reproduce, those are the ones that are going to get resources and live. And then those traits are heritable. In other words, they're going to pass those traits on to the next generation of oak trees. So organisms change from one generation to the next. So number 3 is that these variations allow some to survive and reproduce at a greater rate. So again, if an acorn starts growing and has larger root system and they're living in a dry area, then it's those acorns that will survive to become oak trees, whereas maybe the acorns that produce smaller root systems would not survive and won't reproduce. So these heritable traits get passed on, in part because those beneficial traits are allowing some individuals to live. So in time, number 4, the individuals that have the best traits produce more offspring, and those traits become more common. So the idea is that as organisms survive and reproduce, the ones that have the best traits pass those traits on to the offspring, and the ones that have traits that aren't beneficial don't pass them on to offspring. So just to give another example, imagine a cheetah. So let's say that cheetah mom has a couple of babies, and some of the babies are faster than others. Well, the ones that are faster are going to catch more antelope or gazelles or whatever, and the ones that are slower are going to go hungry more often. So it's more likely that the faster cheetahs will catch more food and therefore will survive, but also will reproduce. And so the next generation of cheetahs will be incrementally faster. So organisms change with time, and they change in ways that benefit them. So organisms have traits that are adaptive. Hold on, let me get caught up. So adaptive traits are genetically based characteristics that make organisms more likely to survive and reproduce. So in the case of A cheetah being fast, that's an example of an adaptive trait. In the case of an acorn with a larger root system, that's an adaptive trait. And so we see that these adaptive traits, they get selected for by different environments, and that natural selection basically can shape these traits and can account for the differences between populations and ultimately for the production of new species. So Darwin is saying that new species can form and that natural selection is the primary mechanism doing this. So Darwin said populations will become more different over time, and this is called evolutionary divergence. All right, Darwin also argued that all the organisms that have ever lived arose through descent with modification. Descent with modification is the evolutionary alteration and diversification of ancestral species. In other words, let's use finches as an example. You have an ancestral finch species that maybe gets blown into the Galapagos Islands in a storm. Let's say it has a medium-sized beak. Well, all the finches with their various beak shapes and sizes have descended from that original finch species, but they've also been modified. They've been modified such that some have smaller beaks and some have larger beaks. And what's true for the finches, Darwin argued, is true for everything. So all organisms descended from a common ancestor. So armadillos descended from glyptodonts, and glyptodonts descended from something else. And humans descended from something which descended from something else. So all organisms can trace their lineage back to common ancestors, and all those ancestors can trace their lineage back to a universal common ancestor that basically gave rise to all living organisms. So he argues all of this in his landmark book, The Origin of Species, which was published in 1859. And basically he said that species change through physical means. In other words, that it's not like the organisms aren't changing from some spiritual direction. The organisms aren't different because they were supernaturally created different. Rather, they're changing because of the environment and inheritance and natural selection. He also argued that change occurs in populations, not individuals. So before, we could maybe see how one giraffe with a larger neck could end up changing the whole giraffe species. And Darwin's saying, no, it's not on individuals. It's going to happen in a population. So there's a population of acorns that maybe have larger root systems that cause that species of oak to change over time. He also argued that natural selection is the main mechanism that's driving evolution, and also that evolution is influenced by the environment. So like we saw with the ostriches and the emus, the environment is going to shape organisms into particular, to have particular characteristics. So it's an interaction between the environment and natural selection. And that's it. Cool. Hey, part 2 coming up.